Before we jump into today's episode, a quick note to say that open wide conversations are for interest only. We don't provide medical or clinical advice or legal or employee relations advice. Please do consult with a qualified healthcare professional if you have specific concerns related to your mental health or any medical conditions. Open Wide is recorded on the land of the Bunurong people. We acknowledge the richness and diversity of Indigenous communities and the wisdom of storytelling that has been passed down from generation to generation. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Hi, I'm Natalie Phillips-Mason, and this is the Open Wired podcast. Through respectful curiosity, we have candid conversations that explore human diversity and how to create inclusive ecosystems for all minds, bodies, and identities. My guests are change makers who are doing the practical, often unglamorous work to make inclusion real. We are streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. This season kicks off with a topic I've connected with for years, not because I'm a board member, I'm actually not, but I have been part of leadership teams during my career and held close working relationships with executives at board level. And as I've learned more about neurodivergence and reflected on my own experiences, I think we need to unpack the way that boards and governance forums invite diverse thinking. As a female now in my 50s, I also wonder how late diagnosed professional women navigate boards that have traditionally been dominated by neuronormative rules, many of them hidden or assumed. So my guest this episode is Sara Harrup. Sara is a Brisbane-based governance professional, executive coach, and the founder of Unique Mind Co. She's pioneering neuroinclusive governance design and brings this work to life across her own portfolio of board roles, including as Deputy Chair of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, Chair of Jabiru and Non-Executive Director at HCI. She coaches neurodivergent executives and board directors and provides training and consulting on neuroaffirming leadership to organisations seeking to move beyond awareness and into genuine structural change. Sara is autistic and ADHD and a person with disability and speaks openly about what it means to govern well when your body and your mind work differently and what boards lose when they're designed with narrow assumptions about how directors' bodies and minds are built. Hi, Sara, and thank you for being candid and coming on board today and sharing your thoughts with us.
Hi, Nat. It's good to be here.
So you are a governance expert and a board chair and a non-executive director, but for those of us who are not so familiar with those terms and those roles, can you describe those in a little bit more detail for us?
So many of the organisations that people know and love in Australia have some kind of a board. So it is a decision-making body, a body of individual people, known often broadly just as directors or board members. And the purpose of being a director of a company is that you have a duty to act in the best interests of the company, to make sure the company is profitable, well run, managing risk. If it's a listed company, that it's, meeting its obligation to shareholders. So in the board world, you sometimes hear the words board member, board director, or non-executive director kind of bandied around as being a similar thing, and they are. So when we say non-executive director, we mean a board member who has no executive role in the organisation. There is such a thing as an executive director. So sometimes you'll have someone who is an executive in an organisation and may actually also be on the board. The term managing director is also referring to somebody who might be in like a CEO role and also on the board. So there's a lot of different terms. Essentially, the roles that I fulfill, I hold no executive role. I am a director on the board or a board member, but I'm not in the day-to-day business.
Essentially, what you're saying is that most organisations have their day-to-day operating, their operations and the people that manage and work in those businesses day-to-day. Boards are kind of outside of that day-to-day realm for the most part, and they are making higher level strategic decisions about the organisation.
That's right. And they're overseeing the performance of the organisation essentially. So the board has one direct report and that's the CEO.
And before we get into the more nuanced elements of our discussion, I'm actually curious as to how you decide. So this is a full-time, you choose to do this for a fair degree of your
Correct.
time.
Yeah.
How do you decide which boards to participate in?
Gosh, there's a question. For me, it looks like anything that's either purpose-led or for the benefit of people. So for me, that part is more about exclusion, in that I'm unlikely to be on any board of an organisation that could potentially cause harm to people. And the other prerequisites for me are the organisation needs to have sufficient size and complexity to engage my brain and how it thinks. So that's pretty broad for me, but other people will have a narrower focus when they're looking for boards. They might only be interested in, say, not-for-profits or purpose-led organisations, or they might have a particular flavour around health or communities, or they might really like private company boards or ASX-listed boards. So for me, it's pretty broad. So I'm on a government board. I'm on a not-for-profit. It's a pretty broad attraction for me.
But it sounds like it has to be values aligned for you, is what I heard in that response.
Yeah. Values aligned and big enough and doing enough things that my intellect will be tickled enough such that because that is a personal thing for me. It's got to tickle my brain enough to make me engage and invest. I learned that early on, that by doing board roles with really small or not very complex organisations, it was harder for me to do that work because my brain just wasn't locked in as much as it is. The more the complexity, the more I'm locked in.
Okay, so that's a really nice inroad to my next question. So you're quite open about your neurodivergence.
I am.
And if you are comfortable to do so, can you share a little bit about how that came about for you?
So I think this really started with the fact that I thought that I had a hearing problem. So in my 30s, I went and got my hearing tested because it didn't make sense to me why sometimes there felt like there was this big delay that somebody would speak. I would say, beg your pardon, and then 30 or 40 seconds later, I go, oh, no, it's all right. No, I know what you said. So that led me to discovering that I had an auditory processing delay. And then that sat in isolation for years and years. And then when my youngest child was in primary school, they were diagnosed ADHD, and the child psychiatrist / pediatrician, he was both, looked at me and said, "It's as heritable as height, Sara." And I went, "Oh, yeah, right. And then I went away and had a think about that. What did he mean by that? So that just started this process of unraveling it all for me. So in the end, all three of my children are autistic and ADHD. So my diagnosis came after the first child's diagnosis. And it was interesting. The ADHD felt easier to come to terms with. I had some internalized ableism over the autism piece, but in fact, I've almost embraced that even more than the ADHD, I think, in terms of I've dealt with the internalized ableism for the most part. I'm very comfortable with just how I operate now. I'm comfortable with who I am.
Yeah. So how long has that taken you to reach that point of comfort?
I'm going to say I've done the most work on that in the last 3 years, but the process for me started, I'm going to say it was about 2021, late 2020, 2021. And I think there was a time where I actually didn't realise that I had this internalized ableism going on. Then once I kind of confronted that, I was like, okay, it's time to start dismantling that. And look, it'll still show up for me every now and again with the shoulds. You should be capable of doing that. You should not need to rest, or, you should be able to push through that. And I think I make different decisions now that acknowledge who I am.
So describe ableism for us, for people who are not familiar, haven't heard that word before.
Look, and this won't necessarily be a textbook definition, but ableism is this set of assumptions around how people are supposed to function and how people are supposed to move through the world, and that anything less than that or different than that is seen as a deficit. So sometimes people find it easier to understand in the context of physical disabilities. It can be a bit of a leap for people around the autism, ADHD stuff. But even if we just take, so I have a range of chronic physical conditions which clustered together are called the pentad super syndrome. That's not a medical term. It's just a colloquial name used for the cluster. In terms of my internalized ableism, the stuff that comes from inside me about that, it's around seeing my need to rest as weakness, or sensing that I can't ask for a break in a meeting because that will be seen as, I'm less than, or I'm not professional, or I can't hack it. I think if you flip the script and go, what's the opposite of ableism? It is that every human being is innately valuable and worthy by virtue of the fact that we exist, that you don't need to perform, show productivity, to be making this big contribution to the world. So that's the other dimension of ableism, is that, you're not a worthwhile human being unless you're contributing something.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because you've chosen the role of boards, as you said, to, in a lot of ways, assess performance, make decisions. And yet what you just described was the fact that everyone needs to exist to be able to live in the world, contribute, participate in whichever way they feel they can, and that sits well with them. And I know that's a little bit of a leap between those two concepts, but in my mind that was an automatic connection, because when we're talking about boards, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but when most people think of boards, they think of middle-aged white men sitting around a big table making decisions on behalf of other people. Now, I know that that's not necessarily the case anymore. I know traditionally kind of has been. Has this been your experience, and is that why you are trying to make an impact by changing the way that boards operate?
Look, I don't know how far away from the notion of middle-aged white men being on boards being the norm. I don't know how far away we've moved from that. Like, definitely there's been progress in that there is some movement around gender equity on boards, but in terms of other different types of identities on boards, we're really not there yet. And particularly in terms of neurodivergent people on boards, there's a really interesting issue in that there are neurodivergent directors that exist, but it is not safe to disclose. When you see board advertisements where they're recruiting directors, you'll sometimes see a call out, not always, but sometimes you'll see a call out for directors from First Nations, disability, whatever backgrounds are encouraged to apply, but you'll never see that include neurodivergent directors. We're not there yet. More often than not, that call out is not present in the recruitment process. So for me, the reason I started this work was, number one, I have a personal experience of what it's like to be a neurodivergent director on a board and how that can be challenging, but also around seeing how my contribution, and the language of boards is always about contribution, how my contribution can actually help boards. Through my coaching work, I've coached many neurodivergent directors who similarly have real challenges presented to them around being able to manage their board work in a way that doesn't adversely affect them while still also bringing their best contribution forward. And so I kind of went, well, I could coach people till the end of my days, and I could sit on boards to the end of my days, or I could try and do something a little bit more to highlight that boards actually could be designed a little differently. And it's not a radical, right? But they could be designed in a way that's more neuroinclusive, which actually would support everyone's performance.
And I do need to call out, I'm married to a middle-aged white man, so I have nothing against middle-aged white men, but it has been the traditional way that boards have always been described, So What is the impact on your nervous system as a neurodivergent board member What is the reality? And we're giggling about it, but it's not really it's actually nothing to laugh about, because I imagine there is quite a bit of nervous system impact when you are continuously sitting in rooms. I'm using the word sitting very specifically.
Yeah, it is
right?
sitting.
So sitting in rooms that have their ways of working that have been ingrained and are, for the most part, quite traditional. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but what is the impact on your nervous system? What have you experienced yourself?
Yeah, so I think there's a few factors, and I've got to remember that this starts from before the board meeting. So the cadence of boards are about a week before the meeting, a board pack lands. The average size of a board pack, depending on the board around Australia, could be from 100 to 400 pages. There are some boards that'll tell you it's 700 pages. And so you've got this very short time window to absorb a very large volume of information. When you get into a board meeting, you're either online or in a physical room, and the two have different impacts. So physical room, sitting down, often no breaks or very short breaks for a number of hours with bright overhead lights. For me, it is the fatigue of overstimulation. So I generally don't sleep the night of a board meeting, and particularly because of the auditory processing delay. When I lie down to try to go to sleep, I have got almost like the entire board meeting replaying in live time in my brain. So my brain is catching up with all of the language and the bits that I missed, and then because of some of the other parts of my neurodivergence, I am re-prosecuting things that happened in that meeting. I'm considering my own performance. I'm probably potentially being a bit hard on myself about that. So it is that inability to sleep, general fatigue, which there's actually can be moments of disassociation that happen depending on the intensity of the board meeting. But I have had meetings where I'm quite disassociated afterwards. I'm just in another nowhere place altogether that, my family can be going, hello, and there's just nobody home. And some of the other stuff is that if your board meetings are accompanied by travel, mine often are, I might be flying, doing a board meeting, flying straight back. So there's physical fatigue for me often the day after, where it's a fogginess and a just not feeling great.
So tell us why you do it then.
Well, yes, I do it because I am fascinated about how organisations work. I am fascinated by how all the parts of something fit together into the whole and how the interplay and the interconnectedness of those parts make something work. Like, it's endlessly fascinating to me. And then you overlay, how does a group of people work together? This weird entity that we call a board, which is a group of quite disparate individuals sometimes working together for a common purpose through all of these really long-standing traditions and strange habituations that we have. It's like, that is also fascinating to me. How do groups of people work together to try and get a good outcome, to try and make good decisions about an organisation, which is where this piece about the complexity that comes in for me. The more complex the organisation, the more number of moving parts, the more complex the interplay of all of the drivers of their performance, the more fascinating it is for me to try and make sense of that and to then work out, as an individual director, where is the sweet spot where I can make some kind of contribution that's going to be helpful.
And that was actually going to be exactly my next question. Okay. As a systems thinker, which is, I think, what you've just described, and someone has a deep interest in organisational systems, what do you think that you bring to that board group that contributes in a way that has a valuable contribution? Because clearly you do. So what from your perspective do you bring, do you think?
Yes.
Sounds like a job interview. It's not a job interview.
No. And look, it's a question that every director has to know about themselves, in that boards are usually skills-based, in that they are looking for the whole, the collective, to have a a range of skills that is made up of the individual skills of the individual directors. So you're always coming in with a particular skill set. So for me, if we just go from a skills perspective, I am a specialist at being a generalist. So I know a bit about a lot of things with particular expertise around leadership, people, transformation. For a non-accountant, I've got some pretty good financial skills. But probably the thing that I really bring, which is the kind of attributes part of what does a director bring to a board, what I've been told, and by other people that I work with, is the way you think is really interesting. The questions that I ask, the kind of angle that I come at things from, I think about things differently to the other people in the group. So I'm often asking things or checking in on things or providing a perspective that is a bit left field, but nonetheless valuable and can really help either to round out a conversation or identify significant risks or opportunities that were being overlooked.
Interesting. And you're not the first neurodivergent board member that I've spoken with who describes that in the same way. So it's really interesting. I do find it psychologically safe to make recommendations in terms of the way that boards work, coming back to that kind of concept of neuroinclusive ways of working. Have you found safe spaces in order to recommend or challenge current ways of working?
It depends on the board, would be my answer. So I've certainly been involved in some boards where you'd want to be even pretty careful how you put a contrary view on anything. And then I've worked with boards that, are more open. If the question really is how much influence have I had on boards in terms of them moving towards more neuro-inclusive practice, I would say that the board that I chair, by virtue of the fact that I'm a chair, I've had a lot more influence there. Boards where I am a director on the board, far less influence. And all my boards are aware that I'm autistic and ADHD. And I don't think it's that boards are closed to change, but the process of becoming more neuro-inclusive does require change.
Yeah, it does.
And board systems are steeped in history and context and sameness. We are still doing governance today, not that differently than how we did it 10, 20, 30 years ago. We can talk about how the discipline's broadened and now we've got to govern AI and all of that. But in terms of board procedures, the infrastructure of how we work together, it hasn't changed much over time.
Right. You mentioned something interesting. You obviously need to have the ability to process visually and get through those very large text-heavy packs. Has AI made it easier to digest those?
You have to be very careful with AI. The things that are written in board packs are confidential and there can be really sensitive information in there. So the way I use AI with my boards is quite similar to how I use it generally, as a bit of a thought partner. As a director, you are a step removed from the organisation. So when you're reading through a board pack, you're picking up on patterns and, a general sense of things. Sometimes I can be picking up on something and I'm not quite sure what it might be that I'm picking up on, and then I'm going to be interested in what does the general evidence say about, let's say I was picking up on something about AI governance and I'm thinking, what does the evidence say about how to do this well? Then I would use AI as a thought partner in a more general sense around help me gather the evidence sources on good AI governance. Or if I've got a sense of an emerging risk, how might I start to hone in on what that risk actually is? So it's kind of like thought partner as opposed to dumping a board pack full of sensitive information into AI and saying,
give me
what
the
do you
summary.
think of this? And in fact, there's been some commentary recently about, because of course, as a director, you have some legal duties and you can be criminally prosecuted for failing your director's duties. And there's been some recent commentary that if you outsource your decision making or, the sources of information to AI, that won't protect you. Like the buck still stops with you. So there's absolutely a place for AI, both as thought partner and aid to a director in their preparation. And there's also a place for it inside the boardroom, but not many boards are entirely comfortable with that yet.
Yeah. So if you were going to design your own neuroinclusive board ways of working, what are the top elements that you would like to see in that ways of working, be it cadence, be it the physical environment?
So I think the number one thing that I would love to see, which is actually a universal thing that all boards talk about, is I would love to see very high quality board papers. So a board pack that passes the sensory test, like there's actually a huge sensory layer on a board pack that is very clear and unambiguous in the language that it uses about what it's seeking, what it's saying. And it's even, people think it's pedantic, but it's even things like if you're putting charts and diagrams and graphs and things, label them. It's literally that simple. Papers that help you orientate quickly to what it is you're being asked to look at, that uses language in a way of explaining things that is clear about what it's trying to tell you and that it's clear in what the ask is. So that's the first thing. The second thing would be, I think, some of the conventions around how we actually communicate in the boardrooms. The number one thing that will make a difference on boards is, well, it's actually two things, the quality of the chair and how they manage the room and invite conversation and dialogue and how they set the tone for what that looks like and what's okay and what's not okay, and also the psychological safety in the room. Those two things make an enormous difference to whether or not a director feels like they can actually say what was really on their mind. There are board meetings happening all over the world where directors are walking away from them going, I only wish I could have been so brave to say that. People can go, well, it's your job to say that. Boards aren't always psychologically safe enough to enable people to say what's on their mind. And then the third thing would be around, can we have a meeting room where the temperature's regulated, where we have decent breaks, access to water, able to go to the bathroom when you need to, like able to stand up freely and stretch if you need to. So, these things are really basic, but they're not permissioned in boardrooms.
So in order to make them permissioned, is that just making that explicit? Starting off a board meeting, I know this is simplifying it, but you've talked about some pretty simple no-cost things there. Is it about making sure that there are breaks adequately spaced through? Is it, and does that not happen because you've just got so much to get through with every board meeting?
Look, all board meetings are the kinds of things where you're in a time-limited environment and usually plenty to get through, but how a chair and company secretary and CEO plan that agenda is really important, to plan it with enough buffer and to plan to have breaks. There is a foundational document most boards have called a board charter, which actually talks a lot about how we work together. Many boards, they'll review their board charter and then they put it in the drawer. The boards that I've chaired, I always encourage a board charter that actually talks about and permissions things like how we will make sure that we break and stay fresh and can remain focused, how we will communicate together. And then I think having a chair that sets the tone for that in meetings makes a difference. Even things like, a lot of boards, people still feel like they've got to go dressed up. If you've got people with different sensory needs or people with disability or people with different cultural backgrounds, it may not always be, they may not want to come wearing a suit. It's often making the covert overt, isn't it? Like you make the implicit explicit.
Yes, exactly.
There is no dress code. So a board that I'm on, we had this chat, there is no dress code here. Come wearing whatever you feel most comfortable in that will allow you to do your best work. And if we happen to be going to an event together that is formal, we'll call that out. But otherwise, for board meetings, if it's a T-shirt, that's fine. You don't need to, and these things also disproportionately affect women who are trying to wear high-heeled shoes and that kind of thing. So it's making the being aware enough of the implicit norms to be able to see them and then to see where they're impacting people and then to make explicit what's okay. Like if anybody needs a stretch, like I've even done things where it's let's actually just take 60 seconds of silence. Boards are very uncomfortable with silence. They want to feel it.
Yeah. Those are quite simple, no cost, elements of running meetings in general, not just board meetings. That applies to organisations, that applies to any sensory environment where people are doing work. So,
and yet though, Nat, isn't it really easy though for people to push them to one side? Like that's the thing that always fascinates me is that if I'm in a meeting and they're running over time and they go, oh, should we just have a working lunch? Just grab a sandwich. Is that all right with everyone? And everyone will go, yeah, that's fine. I don't know why. Like we've got these norms about pushing through. So we're our own worst enemies, right?
Yeah. And I just think, to your earlier point, more often than not, it's, well, if I'm the only one that says that I'm not okay with having a working lunch, is that going to, that's, I'm going to be called out, I'm going to look different, I'm going to be the one that is causing an issue or disrupting. But to your point, if the chair has been educated around neuroinclusive practice, then maybe that's step one. I don't know if there's any neuroinclusion education going on within the board space apart from what you're doing and probably what other neurodivergent board members are doing as well.
Well, and it's interesting because if, like I did a little bit of work to the extent that I can, with some boards you can actually, through a process of looking at annual reports, you can work out the tenure of different directors. And through a process of having a look at some boards, like you can actually find that the tenure of neurodivergent directors is less than the tenure of others. There's not a lot of education happening in the space. And at the moment, I don't even think boards are tuned into why would we care about that.
Yeah, but that's part of the education process.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's plenty more that we could talk about, and there's lots of neuroinclusive education and activity and ways of working that, even if people listening to this conversation take one thing away, that's a good thing. So I just wanted to thank you for being, for being so honest and sharing your experiences and, in a job category that, as you mentioned, isn't psychologically safe a lot of times. It's fantastic to have had you on talking about things from your view and your firsthand experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Nat.
If you found value in today's chat, the best way to support the podcast is to share it with a colleague. Make sure you hit follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And I'm always eager to hear your takeaways. So do drop me a DM on Instagram at Inclusive Change or send me an email. All the links to connect with me and to learn more about today's guests are waiting for you in the episode description. Thanks again for being here, and I'll catch you next time.